Hello, and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. Our organisation has recently published a new pamphlet called The New Party We Need. In it, we sketch out the case for a new, working-class anti-war, anti-austerity and left party with a socialist programme. We stand for a new party which can unite workers, anti-racists, feminists, climate campaigners and others in struggle. A new party to cut across and to fight the growth of Reform UK. In this episode, I'm speaking with two of the authors of this pamphlet, Claire Laker-Mansfield and Conor Rosamond from Socialist Alternative's Political Committee. But of course, you should get your own copy. Go to socialistalternative.info to pick up your own copy today. With that said, let's get into it. So, Conor, what is the central point that this new pamphlet makes, and why has Socialist Alternative produced it now?
Well, we produced this pamphlet in the context of the coming to power of this new Keir Starmer-led Labour government, which is, of course, a thoroughly pro-capitalist government, defends the status quo and the profits of big business. But it's a government that's come to power at the time of at a time of huge crises. So we're seeing war, the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis, but at the same time as well, of course, big protest movements against these things. We've seen mass struggles against the cost of living crisis in recent years, like the strike wave, but also a huge movement against the genocidal onslaught in Gaza, and similar things happening all around the world. And right now, we would say there's a political vacuum. There's a question that's posed right now of who will be the opposition to a Starmer government. And of course, right now, Nigel Farage is looking to fill that vacuum himself with Reform UK. And the threat of the far right, of course, is a big issue right now. Reform UK, who to a certain extent represent that, although I think they have a much broader reach as well, they got a huge result coming out of the election, but also we've seen similar trends all around the world. So campaigns from people like Trump, Marine Le Pen in France, and so on. These far-right politicians who are able to profit off the failure of establishment politicians like Keir Starmer. And so this question of who is the opposition is posed. At the same time, though, there's also an ongoing discussion in the workers' movement and on the left about this idea that we need a new political force that can organise and represent workers and young people and fight for our interests. We've seen groups like Collective, which Jeremy Corbyn's been involved in, and other events and discussions taking place to talk about this idea. And I think it really is actually quite likely that something over the next year will come out of these discussions and moves towards a new formation. And this pamphlet is about engaging in that discussion. So we agree with the need for a new party, and we will support any serious initiatives to set one up. But we also think there needs to be a discussion about what that party should look like, how it should organise, and also what it should stand for. And in the pamphlet, we kind of lay out what we think that party should look like.
Well, I guess that brings me on to the next question, which I'd like to ask Claire. And that question is, how do you think that this whole question of a new party is being posed in people's minds right now? And is there an opening for it at this point in time?
I think increasingly the debate now is moving on from, do we need a new party? That had been like a big debate on the left before Corbyn. And in a sense, it came back after the 2019 general election. But I think actually now that Labour are in power, that debate is becoming more and more settled, I think, amongst left-wing commentators and so on. And people are now starting to think more about, well, what kind of party do we need? How do we get one that's going to be successful? And as Conor said, I think that's what this pamphlet is trying to, offer answers to. That's why it's perhaps appealing to people when they're picking it up on the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, to move us on then to another question, what sort of new party is Socialist Alternative arguing that we need right now? And what do we think is necessary?
Well, there's a number of aspects to that question. I think one of the things that we're arguing is that what we don't need is just a rerun of either the Labour Party in terms of how that was originally set up at the turn of the century, just over 100 years ago, or some of the new left parties which have emerged over the last 10, 20 years, which have in some cases been able to grow quite rapidly, in some cases even come to power, but which have also had tended to have quite serious inbuilt flaws, which have meant that they haven't been able to really deliver for the people who've put hope in them. So one of the first things that we're saying is that this needs to be a party which is not just about elections. One of the lessons, I think, of the recent election results, where we saw this massive surge in support for candidates who were running as independents against the Blairites, was that those who were doing that on the basis of the movement against the war in Gaza tended to be more successful, and that was because they were basing themselves. Obviously, there's complete revulsion at the genocidal onslaught that's going on currently in the Middle East, but those candidates were basing themselves on a living struggle. So we are arguing that for a party to genuinely root itself in working class communities, it needs to do more than just stand in elections. We would conceive of a new party as having its main role as being to organise working class people. So that means bringing together trade unionists, campaigners, people who are fighting back against environmental destruction, people who are feminist campaigners, anti-racist campaigners, people who are struggling within workplaces for increases in wages and better conditions and against job losses and so on. So first of all, I think the first role that a party could have is to bring different groups of working class people together and to help organise and coordinate struggle. And then the second thing we're arguing is that it needs to be a party which is democratic, which has real involvement in decision making by its membership, by trade unions and other groups which might affiliate, and in which the leadership of the organisation is genuinely accountable to the membership. So there's, the right to elect your leadership, to recall them if they're not doing the job that you want them to be doing, and so on. And then I think the final key aspect of what we're arguing in terms of what kind of new party is that it needs to be based around the right kind of ideas, and this draws in some of the lessons again of previous experiences, including recent ones with Corbynism and so on. We're saying that fundamentally there's a contradiction in the interests of working class people and the interests of their bosses, of the super rich 1%. And those contradictory interests can't be reconciled to one another. They can't, you can't actually represent both groups. What tends to happen is that when a party tries to do that, it ends up, when it comes down to it, back in the interests of the rich, back in the interests of the capitalist class. So we're saying it needs to be an organisation which is striving and which is fighting to establish an independent voice for working class people and bases itself around socialist ideas and policies. So that's the basic outline of what we're arguing for.
And I think it's also important to say that when we say that, it's not to say that this is contrary to standing in elections. And in fact, the independent victories, the left independent councillors that we've seen elected over the last year shows that we can actually fight and win against Labour, and we can break through even in the first past the post system. And it is important that we show that, but I think also the movements that we've built over the last period have shown that just asking Labour to make the changes we need isn't going to be enough. We do need a political alternative to Labour that contends for positions, but our starting point isn't about just building like an electoral vehicle. So when we talk about a party, we don't just mean something that stands in elections. So we talk about this idea a lot of it being a party of struggle, something that's rooted in the workers' movement, in other struggles like the movement against the genocidal onslaught in Gaza, rooted in things like the climate movement or feminist struggles and so on. And a party whose core role is to collectively organise the different struggles that are taking place right now, organising them collectively behind the idea of a common organisation and also a common political programme that can draw together those struggles that are taking place. And elections, of course, can be an important platform for those struggles and for the political demands that we want to see put forward. But I think that's a different thing to just sort of being electoralist, like seeing elections as the end goal in and of themselves. So we would say that for a New Left Party, the starting point shouldn't just be winning seats in Parliament or local councils, because we know ultimately that's not where our power lies and where change ultimately comes from. It's not just through like legislation and parliamentary arithmetic, but it's through like the wider balance of forces in society, of class forces, and ultimately struggle. So a new party, even at a very early stage with like a handful of MPs, but one that's backed by mass struggle and able to fight for its ideas, can still actually play a decisive role, even without like a huge number of elected people in that sort of stage.
So I think it's a good time for us now to move on to a few frequently asked questions which tend to come up, when we stress the need for a New Left Party to people. You can call it a bit of a Socialist Alternative FAQ, if you want to call it that. So the first question is, why do we think that we can't focus on reclaiming the Labour Party? And while we're at it, what are some of the lessons from the Corbyn era in the Labour Party?
Yeah, well, of course, that is something that's come up in discussions around this question of a new party, and in many ways, the Corbyn phenomenon did pose the possibility of transforming the Labour Party. That is true. His election as the Labour Party leader was an earthquake in British politics. Thousands of people joined Labour to support his policies, and the party had over 500,000 members at its peak a few years ago. But I think it's also crucial to point out that from the beginning, Corbyn's leadership was under assault from the Blairite right wing of the party. And so the question of reclaiming, of transforming Labour even, wasn't just possible, but actually it was necessary as well. The whole party machine was completely hostile to Corbyn and the sort of left-wing ideas that he represented, things like renationalising mail, rail and utilities, taxing the rich to fund public services and so on. And we said at the time that it would be necessary to break with the Blairites, to mobilise the thousands of pro-Corbyn Labour members, to democratically deselect the Blairite MPs who were presiding over most local Labour parties, and also replace them with people who actually represent the views of the membership and who back Corbyn. But Corbyn's approach wasn't based on like struggle in that sort of way. It was based on kind of institutional reform through the Labour Party machine, which unfortunately was like a thoroughly rotten machine, through Parliament, through the capitalist system. But the problem is, all of those things were waging a determined campaign against Corbyn, and it actually wasn't possible to collaborate with those sections of the party, because our interests as working people and the interests of this system are diametrically opposed. So rather than fight back with like equal determination to the viciousness of the Blairites, Corbyn's approach was more about like looking to compromise. So he appointed people like Keir Starmer into front bench positions. He refused to put forward like a real position around Brexit, and he also failed to confront the accusations of anti-Semitism. Instead, he apologised for anti-Semitism in the party rather than calling out for what it ultimately was, which was basically a slander campaign by the mainstream press against Corbyn and his principled stand against the Israeli occupation regime. But since the 2019 election, which the Tories won, and of course following which Corbyn stepped down, the right wing have continued that assault, and they've taken back control of the party with exactly really like the sort of determination that Corbyn refused to mount. They've done what Corbyn failed to do and totally ridded the party of their kind of class enemies. They've stitched up the structures of the party, and they've really made sure that another kind of Corbyn moment can't happen again. Could we rule out, though, that a hanger-on from the Labour left wins a leadership election in the future? I mean, we can't rule it out, but is there a basis for them to transform the party in the way that is needed? And will they be prepared as well to wage that sort of struggle? And we would say that that's very unlikely. Most activists now are outside of Labour anyway. They're rightly disgusted by Starmer, and many would say that we need a new left party rather than fighting the Blairite machine in Labour, which would be seen by many activists as a waste of energy, and I think correctly so. And instead, what we should be fighting for is a vehicle that is genuinely our own.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The only thing I would perhaps add as well is it's important to remember that the reason why the Corbyn moment was allowed to happen was in some senses that the right was incredibly complacent at that time. They thought there was pretty much no possibility that not just Corbyn would win, but really they didn't even think that he would have much chance of impacting the debate and the discussion around the Labour leadership election. So they allowed him on the ballot because they thought that it would just confirm once again that the left is not viable, that it doesn't have support in society, that, you know, it's a bit of a joke almost. So you had Blairites like Margaret Beckett, prominent Blairite former Foreign Secretary, lending Corbyn nominations to get him on the ballot paper. I think that it's pretty ruled out now that the right within Labour would be so stupid once again, basically. I think that they're well aware that if a left-wing candidate were to get on the ballot paper, that they would have a chance of winning and appealing over the heads of the MPs in Parliament to Labour members, but also other people who are able to register in the election to vote. So I think it would be pretty ruled out that they would allow that to happen unless something very unforeseen takes place.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that brings us on to the next question, which is a fairly big question. It's one that comes up when we're talking to people about the question of a new party, and that is, what about the Green Party? Are they not a left-wing party which already exists? Should we be supporting them instead?
I think, first of all, it's worth saying that the massive increase that the Greens have had in their support is a representation of the huge vacuum that exists in British politics on the left and the desire that there is amongst very wide layers of ordinary people, working class people, young people, to see something which offers a real alternative. So people will probably have seen the statistics from the election. The Green Party's picked up 4 million votes. They won 4 seats from that. Obviously, that's a very small number of seats compared to the number of votes that they won. And I think that was also in the context of a very small amount of media coverage that they received. If you compare what Reform got in terms of coverage on the television and the radio and everywhere, really, it was almost like you couldn't turn around without, you know, having to hear the awful voice of Nigel Farage coming at you. I think that indicates that the manifesto that the Greens put forward, which was a bit like a version of Corbyn's manifesto from 2017 or 2019, perhaps not quite as good, but it had a lot of good policies in it. But that manifesto was able to cut through, and people liked those policies and they voted for them. And it's interesting also to look at who voted for the Greens. I saw a study which showed that the Greens got their highest votes by far in areas where there are the highest levels of poverty. Child poverty specifically was the study that I saw. And if you contrast that with the Lib Dems, who I think many people might assume would have a somewhat similar voting base to the Greens, it's actually the opposite for the Lib Dems. So the Lib Dems had their highest votes in constituencies where rates of poverty, child poverty, are the lowest. The Greens had their highest votes where rates of child poverty are the highest. It's like that they were the polar opposite. So that shows you who's voting for them. So, you know, should we just get behind the Green Party? I think that our view would be there are certainly many people who are supporting the Green Party who we would want to be part of a new left party of struggle, and there are also people who are perhaps involved in the Green Party at higher levels who might be able to play such a role. We would say that it's a positive thing that the independent MPs have worked with the Greens on issues where they agree. We would really say that the Green MPs should join up with Jeremy Corbyn and the Independents to form a strong left bloc, and potentially that could help be the basis for the launch of some kind of new left party, along with activists, trade unionists and so on coming together in a conference. So we would say that they could play that role. The Green Party itself is not based on the trade union or labour movement in any way. And that's not just an organisational question. The Green Party is not a party which has strong links with trade unions, either like through formal affiliations or just in terms of being a party which is involved in trade union struggle. But I would say more than that, it's not a party which has at its foundation a set of ideas which point in a clear way beyond the capitalist system. And so although it has many left-wing policies at the moment, it's not a party which has like built into its foundations the idea of needing to struggle for a society which is working in the interests of the working class. It's not got that kind of ideological foundation. And I think that has had an impact on the way in which Green Party representatives, when they've been elected, have tended to respond to the pressures that they immediately start to come under. So, I mean, there are a couple of places now where the Green Party have been able to run councils, most notably Brighton, where they've been faced with the same challenges which councillors are faced with everywhere. A government which is cutting, the Tory government at the time, which was massively attacking local government budgets and reducing the grants that they get from the government, from central government, and the choice really that councils are then faced with in that scenario, which is, what do we do about that? Do we pass on this austerity to the working class communities we've been elected to represent? Do we make cuts to jobs? Do we crack down on people's wages and reduce those? Do we reduce public services, close libraries, nurseries, etc.? Or do we try and mobilise in whatever way we can a campaign in our areas to fight back against this? Do we refuse to pass on the austerity? Do we say we're going to call on councils to follow our example? And the Green Party, when they've been in control of councils, they've not really behaved in any way that's distinguishable from Blairite Labour councils. So in Brighton, for example, there was a strike of bin workers, a low-paid group of workers looking for a reasonable pay rise, and that the Green Party council responded to that by bringing in strike-breaking agencies, using the kind of playbook really that the right have used in trying to undermine workers' action. And they also carried out cuts to services and so on. So I think that indicates that the Green Party, as it exists now, is not the finished article, and it is not just something that we could straightforwardly say, let's all go and join the Green Party, vote for them, and then that will be enough to win the kind of change that we need. But what we would say is that there should not be a sort of sectarian attitude to the Greens. But I mean, from our perspective, that goes two ways. The Greens stood against Jeremy Corbyn in Islington, for example. We would say that was a mistake. We think those supporting them should be involved in the discussions around forming a new party, and potentially even in some kind of organisational alliance or something like that.
I agree. And of course, a lot of those people who are joining the Greens or voting for them, they're not doing that because they broke the Brighton bin strike. They're doing it because, they're seen as representing an alternative to the Tories and Labour, a left-wing progressive alternative that fights for things like the climate where the other parties don't, which is a very good thing. And actually, we've also seen, new kind of rank and file grassroots left networks and so on being set up within the Greens, which is a positive development. And I think those people who are fighting to build a left-wing political alternative should be welcome at any discussions about the idea of building a new party. And ultimately, even if the leadership of the Green Party might be less in favour of setting up a new formation, they've got their own sort of party and political careers as well that they're looking out for. Those people within the Greens who are fighting these sorts of battles should absolutely be welcome at any discussions about setting up a new party, and they should be invited to be a part of this process.
So let's move on to talking about history now then. There have been lots of attempts in the past at setting up new left parties, new working class parties, But I think a lot of people listening to this podcast might not remember those past attempts, or maybe even weren't alive at the time. Maybe, Claire, you could talk a little bit about those past attempts, but also what are the sorts of lessons that the pamphlet draws out from that history?
So the pamphlet has a number of different chapters which are looking at different lessons from recent history and history further back. In terms of the new left parties, in inverted commas, that have been established or attempted to be established in Britain over the last 30 years or so, it goes through a few different examples of where different people have tried to establish something to the left of Labour. And I think that there are some useful insights from those experiences. So it starts off talking about something called the Socialist Alliance, which was a group which brought together different small left parties, and those small left parties then stood in elections under a united banner. One of the kind of inherent weaknesses that there were with that from the beginning was that it was mainly just based on existing already quite small forces, so it didn't have a wide basis, and it didn't have lots of working class people who were not already involved in another left group coming towards it. And one of the things that then happened with that was that one left group, the Socialist Workers' Party, were able to bulldoze through a change which meant that they would be able to outvote everyone else, and that led to the alliance essentially breaking up. Another example that's referred to is Respect. Most people will probably be familiar with George Galloway, very famous and well-known figure. It wouldn't necessarily be quite correct to even characterise him at this stage in his political career as being on the left, because he's now, as well as putting forward many left-wing economic ideas, flirting with quite reactionary ideas around particularly things like trans rights and other questions like that, women's rights. At the time, that was not so much his focus, but he set up, along with other small left-wing forces, the SWP particularly, Respect at the time of the anti-war movement. And there was actually huge potential in the idea of a new workers' party at that moment. There was massive anger against the war. The Blairite Labour government was obviously responsible for that, and people could see that. But that was a party which focused almost exclusively on trying to appeal to one specific group of working class people. It was very, very focused on trying to win seats in areas which had particularly high populations of Muslims, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that, but there wasn't really any idea about how you might broaden the appeal that organisation would have, and to branch out and to win support from other sections of the working class as well, and linking the issue of the war to the wider economic demands that working class people would have across different communities. So that was another attempt which didn't really succeed. And then there are other examples. The Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, which was a organisation which brought together the RMT Union, some other prominent trade unionists at the time, and also small left forces, the Socialist Party, which at the time Socialist Alternative was members were part of, and that was an important step at that time in establishing the idea that there needs to be an alternative to Labour, that trade unionists and other campaigners should stand in elections, and that doing so was important. But when Corbyn won the leadership of the Labour Party, it became quite clear relatively quickly that people who might have been looking for an alternative to Labour were increasingly seeing Corbyn's leadership as the way in which that alternative could be established as something which had a mass appeal, which was there in the mainstream. And so that cut across really the idea of standing with Tusk, and the votes that Tusk was able to achieve were and continue to be very small. And I think that project has not been able to take the campaign for a new party forward. So I think in this period it's very clear that something new needs to be built, and the figures who have the most authority, or the figure who has the most authority still in this country to be part of sparking that and galvanising working class people and trade unionists and other activists to get involved, is Corbyn, and to a lesser extent the other group of left-wing MPs that exist around him in Parliament. So we would argue that it's his role now to help call a conference which could bring together different people to discuss launching something, bring together trade unionists, bring together campaigners, and get everyone discussing how we launch something new, along with the MPs that there are currently.
Yeah, and well, similarly, there's clearly lots of lessons that socialists in the left can draw out of experiences from around the world as well, isn't there? International lessons. And the pamphlet does say a bit about that as well, doesn't it, Connor?
Yeah, well, in recent years we've actually seen a number of attempts at setting up new left alternatives around the world, and that experience I think is very useful to learn from. And in International Socialist Alternative, we've actually talked about the development of these kind of new left formations. They've often been breakaways from the old social democratic parties, where people have stood against the shift to the right of those parties, against austerity and other anti-working class ideas and policies put forward by those parties, especially in government. However, when you look at that experience, in pretty much every case, these new left formations have hit a sort of dead end at one stage or another. We see that most strikingly really with Syriza in Greece, who came to power in that country in the mid-2010s in the aftermath of huge economic problems in Greece following the financial crisis, the world recession around 2008, and that hit Greece particularly hard. So Syriza were elected on the basis of an anti-austerity kind of platform, and they had to face, in getting elected, huge pressure from the ruling class, not least the troika of the European Central Bank, the European Commission and the IMF, to pass brutal austerity measures to fix the Greek economy in the eyes of the ruling class. So Syriza, instead, they put it to the people of Greece, the working class of Greece. They organised a referendum and they said, are you in favour of the austerity package or not? And there was a huge resounding no vote, that we're against this austerity. But actually, eventually, Syriza caved to the pressure and passed this brutal austerity, and it was a disaster for them. We've seen their popularity really crumble. But it's not just been in Greece. We've also seen parties hit dead ends in other places. So in Spain right now, Podemos was similarly like the left party set up as a left alternative to the Social Democrats. But now they're actually in a coalition government with those very same Social Democrats. And that's left them tied to all of the deserving anger from the working class about the sorts of policies put forward by the government at the moment as it tries to essentially manage this capitalist system, right? And the result that we're seeing is, again, like, Podemos' support is declining, and the far-right party, Vox, are able to make headway in that vacuum. Which is also what we're seeing in Greece now, by the way. The far-right have been able to regroup and regain support after really being pushed back during the time of Syriza. But also in Brazil, we're seeing PSOL, the left party, the Socialism and Liberty Party, which was formed, again, as an opposition, an anti-austerity opposition to the cuts being put forward by the Lula government in the early 2000s. Now PSOL is part of the Lula government, and actually in this current context, Bolsonaro and the far right are able to regroup, but there's no left challenge to that, and that's a big problem. So I think, we need to be very clear, actually, that lesser evilism and any sort of idea of collaborating with the bosses and their system, trying to manage their system for them, is a dead end. It's going to be a route to failure and disaster for a left party. And instead, we need to stand on our own 2 feet. We need to really be a party of and for working class interests. And on that basis, I think we can learn from those lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. And, well, I think we can start to move this episode to a close now. But before we do, one last question. What, in the view of Socialist Alternative, should a new party actually stand for? What sort of programme do we think a new party has to actually fight for going forward?
Well, we've heard about the experience of Corbynism and other left phenomena around the world just now. And I think that goes to show that simply having a new left party isn't enough. The question is also what it stands for, and really that's decisive. And we think that it needs to be a programme based in working class independence and struggle, rather than accommodation with the system and the political establishment, because I think, as we've seen, that would be beyond a dead end, actually, the recipe for such a party to end up betraying the aspirations of workers and young people who could end up looking towards a new left party. And that's what the experience in Syriza showed, and in Germany and so on, where the left failed to provide a clear alternative, and they've been punished in recent elections for it, and the far right have made big gains off the back of that. So a new left party needs to stand decisively against lesser evilism, as we've kind of outlined, which has left many new left parties to just become essentially like junior partners of the existing parties of the discredited political centre. And it needs to be clear that it also, a new party is not just here to govern over the current system, and instead we say that it needs to stand on the basis of demands that can mobilise the whole working class to fight in our interests, and which ultimately points towards the need for a fundamental break with the capitalist system under which we live today. So, we outline like a general idea of the sorts of policies that might look like in the pamphlet. So a pay rise for all workers, for instance, tied to the rate of inflation, to reverse as well the anti-trade union laws, all of them, and also the anti-protest laws that have restricted our democratic rights under the Tories, but which are still being upheld by the Labour government. Other things, tackling the housing crisis by fighting for rent control and a mass programme of council house building and green infrastructure as well. It would also need to stand against war and imperialism, of course, for the ending of arms sales to Israel, the nationalising of arms companies, transferring those companies over to socially useful production while defending jobs, but also policies that can point away beyond like right-wing reaction and show up parties like Reform UK for not really having any answers for working class people. And that means building a united struggle of the whole multiracial, multinational working class that can point a way out of this kind of social crisis in Britain and cut across the scapegoating of refugees for that crisis. So, fighting for equal pay and trade union rights, for instance, for migrant workers, and saying rather than attacking migrants for the strain on our NHS, we need a struggle of both British-born and migrant workers to end the grinding down of the health service, to take it back into public ownership, to fund it properly, and similarly in education and across society. But enacting these sorts of measures isn't just going to be accepted by the ruling class, of course. To make such a programme a reality, we need to more broadly take the wealth and the power out of the hands of the capitalist class who currently have control over that wealth and over the rest of society, whether that be in kind of pure economic terms through businesses and banks and so on, through the capitalist state itself, of course, which uses all sorts of means to prevent any sort of like radical change, and instead society as a whole needs to be taken into democratic control by working class people so that we can fund the massive investment that we desperately need, so that we can run society in the interests of need, not profit. And of course that isn't necessarily what like Corbyn and Jamie Driscoll and current figures at the head of these discussions about a new party are calling for at this stage, but where this idea of a new party is mobilising the enthusiasm of workers and young people who are looking to organise, looking to fight back. We want to engage in these discussions and support the development of any new organisation, but at the same time we also want to point towards what we think will be necessary for a new organisation to really deliver on what working people need, and to say as well, like, if you want to help fight for a programme like this, then we need to organise for it. We need to build an organisation that's able to put these ideas forward, and that's what Socialist Alternative is about. And so I'd also, I guess, just add to anyone who's listening that if you agree with the sort of thing that we're calling for here and the sort of idea of what sort of party we need, we would say join us. We would say read the pamphlet, and if you agree with the ideas, help us fight for them and build a party that can really carry out the aspirations of working class people and young people and deliver on the change that we need.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Revolutionary Ideas. If you like what you've heard, make sure to subscribe and follow us on all platforms. Don't forget to buy your copy of The New Party We Need, and to do that you can go to socialistalternative.info. Also make sure you follow us on social media. On Instagram, we're socialistalternative.ews. On Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative ISA England, Wales and Scotland. On X, or formerly known as Twitter, we're Socialist Alt EWS. And last but not least, on Blue Sky, we're socialistaltews.bsky.social. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.